Hey team. All right, so today we're going to talk about how to write an FRQ, which is the free response question part of the exam, right? So we're going to do a model. We're going to go through a bunch of stuff that you need to know, and then we're going to do a model together. And then you will have two more that you're going to need to do on your own, okay? So the AP exam is set up with 100 multiple choice questions and 2 FRQs. And each of those things is a third of the grade for the test. So the multiple choice questions are a third of the grade, FRQ 1 is a third of the grade, and FRQ 2 is a third of the grade. You get, I think, 65 minutes for the multiple choice, but I will double check. And for sure, you get 50 minutes to do both FRQs. So that works out to about 25 minutes per question. You're going to need to manage your own time with that. They'll tell you when to start. They might give you a 5-minute warning and then the ending, and that's pretty much it. So you're going to have to really make sure that you're not spending 45 minutes on the first FRQ and then you don't do the second one at all. Because if you can do some parts of both of them and get it right, that's going to be better for your grade, okay? So there are 2 types of FRQs on the test. There's usually one that's a scenario and one that's research-based. So a scenario prompt will lay out a situation for you, and then it will give you a list of terms, usually between 6 and 8 terms, that you need to apply to that situation. Okay, so for example, our scenario is someone applying to college here, and our term is hindsight bias. I know you don't know what that means. So then we would have to answer something like this. We would have to say hindsight bias is, and give the definition. And then we would have to say how it applies to the term. So we'd say hindsight bias is when the result of a situation feels like it was inevitable. And this applies to Anna because when she got rejected from NYU, she thought, I knew it. I'll go through another example with a term that you know. So let's say still our scenario is someone applying to college, and our term is frontal lobe. So I might say something like, the frontal lobe is responsible for decision-making and judgment. When Anna gets accepted into 2 different colleges, she uses her frontal lobe to decide which college to go to, okay? We're going to go through a whole example together, so you'll get to practice this again. The other type of FRQ is an experimental FRQ, and that will ask you one of 2 things. You will either need to discuss different types of research, their advantages and their disadvantages, or you will need to do something with a study, either design an experiment or break one apart. And that's when you're going to see the terms like independent variable, dependent variable, correlation, case study, all those types of research that we talked about, range, mean, median, mode, all that kind of stuff. So you need to know those cold because I can guarantee you they will be on the test. We will review them a bunch. I'll give you assignments with them on. I'll give you test questions. I'll give you FRQs. We'll do the whole thing. I got you, all right? In terms of actually practicing for an FRQ, from here on out, you're going to have an FRQ on each of your tests, and you're going to have a practice one, at least one practice one in each unit. And sometimes we might do 2 practice ones. When you're writing an FRQ, a couple of things to keep in mind. First is that you're not going to know everything they list. We're not going to have talked about it. The reason they do that is because that helps differentiate the kids that are a 4 from the kids that get a 5, right? So those more obscure terms are to help kind of like differentiate between the scores. It's okay to not know everything. It's really, really okay. We have a limited amount of time. We can't cover everything. There are just some things that I'm not going to have talked about that might be on the test. It's not going to hurt you as long as you know most of the stuff. The next thing to keep in mind is that you need to keep it short and sweet. This is not one of Mr. Van Owen's essays. Do not give me 15 sentences about one term. 2 maximum. 2. And I'll show you how to do that. Okay. If you cannot explain the term and its usage in 2 sentences, then you don't know the term well enough. That's a good indicator for you. Okay. So you really, really, really want to keep it short and sweet. AP readers read thousands of these in one weekend. They don't have time to be reading your whole big long essay about independent variables. Okay. You want to make sure you plan before you write, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And when you do write your answers down, you need to leave a space for all of the terms. Even if you don't know one, you need to list them out. And then if you don't know it, just leave it blank. Leave a space for it, but just leave it blank. And don't switch the order around, because again, the readers do these thousands and thousands of these in one weekend. And if you do them out of order, that makes it really hard for them to find your answer, and they may actually miss points that you deserve to get. So you got to make it as easy for them as possible. All right, so when you actually sit down to do an FRQ, you need to read the question, and then you need to read it again, because sometimes the wording can be a little bit tricky. And so you want to read it twice to make sure that you really understand what it's asking you, and that doesn't throw off your answer for any of the terms. You're going to make notes if you need to. You're going to outline what you might want to write. Excuse me. And when you start writing, like we said, you're going to do 2 sentences max. The first thing you're going to do is give the definition of the term, and the second thing you're going to do is apply it to the scenario in question. If you don't apply the term to the scenario in question, so let's say you only give the definition, you won't get the point for that term. You must apply it to the scenario, okay? So we're going to go through an FRQ together, one that's been on a previous test. And this happens to be an experimental one. And these are often harder. So we're going to go through these, okay? Ooh, excuse me. Ooh, so yawny. All right, so you can open up your, your assignment in iLearn, or in Google Assignments, and we're going to go through it together. So I'm going to think aloud for this whole thing, including what happens if I don't know something, how do I answer this, what do I do? And then when you scroll down, you'll find that you have 2 more. So question number 2 is another experimental one, and question number 3 is a scenario-based one, okay? All right, so let's go back to question number 1 and start working. Dr. Schwartz wants to investigate the relationship between the use of herbal medicines and the reduction of depressive symptoms in women. She got permission to use the freshman class of women at her local university. She met with the women, explained the purpose of her research, and surveyed them to find out which women were already using herbal medicines. Now, she wants to set up an experimental design. She wants to set up an experimental design to determine how the use of herbal medicines would affect the moods of other women in the freshman class. You're going to set up an experimental design for this study and include all the following in your explanation. Describe a hypothesis for this study. Describe an appropriate sampling method. What is the operational definition of independent variable? What is the operational definition of dependent variable? Based on the information provided, identify one possible problem with the population of women she has chosen to study. Identify how Dr. Schwartz could control for experimental bias or participant bias in this study. Explain one statistical technique that Dr. Schwartz could use to describe the results based on her hypothesis. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pause the video here and to reread this again for yourself. Okay, so let's get started with our answer. I reread this again, made sure I know what it's asking, and I'm going to go ahead and get started. It's a little hard for me to do the notes part on here, but I could do that off to the side. Maybe I want to make notes about the group she's using or how she's doing the experiment, whatever. So now, I'm so sorry. So now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to answer. So my first question is, describe a hypothesis for this study. So I'm going to say, Dr. Schwartz. Okay, so I know, hang on, let me just read it one more time. So she wants to investigate the relationship between the use of herbal medicines and the reduction or the lessening of depressive symptoms in women. So I'm going to say a hypothesis for this experiment could be that herbal medicines, I want to be more specific, could be that using herbal medicines decreases the effect, decreases depressive symptoms in women. Okay. 2, describe an appropriate sampling method. Okay, well, I know we want to give everybody the chance, right? And I know that she surveyed women to find out which ones were already using herbal medicines. Well, I don't know if she'd want to use them because she doesn't have a before, like she doesn't know what it's like when they're not using them. So I'm going to say she would just use the women who were not already using herbal medicines. And she can randomly select, let's say 100 names out of the pool. Okay, so she will reduce the pool of participants to women who were not using herbal medicines and choose, let's say 200, so she can have a bigger sample. Great. Number 3, what's the operational definition of the independent variable? So we haven't really talked about that, but operational definition means what is the dose, the timing, the actual thing. So it wouldn't be like, if we go back to our example, we've been talking about our study with coffee and sleep. It wouldn't be just drinking coffee. The operational definition would be drinking 1 cup of coffee before 3 p.m. Okay? Because we have to be super, super specific so that people can replicate results. So the operational definition of the independent variable would be, okay, and now I'm just going to go back to the question. And the independent variable would be the herbal medicine because that's the one that she is adjusting, right? But I don't know which herbal medicine that is. I don't know timing. I don't know how much. So I'm going to have to make that up. So the operational definition would be, let's say, 50 milligrams of the selected herbal medicine each morning. Great. Okay. 4, what is the operational definition of the dependent variable? Okay, so I remember that the dependent variable is the effect, right? The one that's the result. So that would be their moods or their depressive symptoms. So I'm going to say the operational definition of the dependent variable is, and I want to say specific symptoms, and I want to do the frequency. So I'm going to say the frequency, because we're looking at if they're reduced, right? Not if they go away altogether, but if they're reduced. So I'm going to say the frequency and severity of depressive symptoms. Okay, great. Number 5, based on the information provided, identify one possible problem. Okay, so when I go back and I look, it says she got permission to use the freshman class of women at her university. But it also says she wants to look at the relationship just in women. So if she's only using the freshman class, that means she's only working with people who are like 18, 19. So what about for 50-year-olds? Like they might not have the same reaction, so she can't generalize her findings. Okay, so I said she can't generalize her findings because her sample contains a very small age range. All right, number 6, identify how she could control for experimenter bias or participant bias. Okay, so we want to make sure she's not, giving anybody advantages or disadvantage, and that they're also not doing that for each other. So when you want to keep both the experimental and the participants safe like that, you use something called the double blind method, which you should know because that was in your reading guide. Okay, so to control for bias, Dr. Schwartz can use the double blind method. Great. And finally, explain one statistical technique that Dr. Schwartz could use to describe the results based on her hypothesis. So let me go back to the hypothesis I said. She said, a hypothesis for this experiment could be that using herbal medicines decreases depressive symptoms in women. So she could use, let me think of the statistics stuff that I know. Mean, median, mode, range, scatter plot. Which one do I think would be best? She could do a scatter plot because if using the herbal medicines, like the usage would stay steady, but the depressive symptoms would go down, but I don't think that's the best. I think she should look at the mean for how often they experience depressive symptoms before and after they were using the medicine. So I'm going to say that one. Okay, Dr. Schwartz should look at the mean number of depressive symptoms participants. Okay, so I said Dr. Schwartz should look at the mean number of depressive symptoms that participants are experiencing before and after taking herbal medicines. So, she would have to give surveys before and after, but she can absolutely do that. Okay. So now I would go back and I would double check. All right, we're going to finish here, and you're going to continue, and you're going to do number 2, and you're going to do number 3.